Hey there tonight. We're not diving into epic battles or royal decrees. We're stepping into two lives lived at opposite ends of the same medieval world. On one side, a king draped in velvet surrounded by courtiers deciding laws. With a nod on the other, a peasant waking cold, working hungry, surviving one season, at a time with nothing but grit and calloused hands. This is about the gap, not just of power but of purpose. Two people born into systems they didn't choose, living days that couldn't be more. Different, one commands, one obeys. One builds empires, the other keeps them running. If this kind of calm, grounded history helps you unwind, feel free to like the video and subscribe. But only if it brings you peace, and let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. I love seeing how far these stories travel before they fade into sleep. So take a breath, dim the lights, settle in, and let's begin with two lives that shaped a world. One silent chore. At a time, you wake up, slowly. Not because you're rested, but because your back is screaming. It's a low, dull ache, like someone quietly grinding a stone into your spine. The straw-stuffed mattress under you is more mold than straw. Now it hasn't been changed in years, and every time you shift your weight, dust and a faint smell of mildew puff into the air. You're sharing this bedding with your wife. 2 children and something you're fairly sure is either a rat or a deeply unlucky squirrel. Either way, it's warm, and that's something. The roof is leaking again. You'd hoped the clay patches you pressed into the holes last autumn would hold through winter, but they didn't. A slow drip has been plinking into a tin bowl all night. It sounds like a cruel clock, plink, plink, plink. There's no fire there was last night. You remember the glow before you fell asleep, huddled in your coarse wool blanket, with your arms wrapped around your youngest child to keep her warm. But now there's nothing but cold ashes and the memory of warmth. Your breath fogs in the air above you. You don't have a chimney, just a hole in the roof that lets the smoke out and the rain in it. Does both jobs poorly outside. Something. Groans might be. The wind might be. The pigs might be your neighbor. Edric already. Splitting wood, you can't tell, doesn't matter. You sit up slowly, careful not to knock over the bowl of water you keep beside the mattress. It's half frozen with a skim of ice. On the top, you break it with your fingers and splash it on your face. It stings. That's how you know you're awake. You pull on your tunic, the same one you wore yesterday and every day before that. Its rough smells faintly of smoke and earth and has been mended so many times. The patches have patches. You'd a rope around your waist. The belt broke last year. Your feet hit the dirt floor. No shoes. You had shoes once, but the soles wore out and the leather cracked. And eventually you just gave up. Now it's bare feet in winter. It's not pleasant, but at least you don't have to worry about thieves stealing them. Your home is one room, no halls, no separate spaces, just a half at the center. A few tools hanging on the wall and scraps of cloth nailed over the windows to block the wind. If you're lucky, there's a bench, stool maybe, a single iron pot. Privacy. Luxury the average medieval peasant lives cheek to jowl with their entire family. And sometimes their livestock, a goat, might sleep near the door for warmth. Chickens peck inside looking for spilled grain. Your wife is still asleep or pretending she was up with the baby again. The child has a fever that won't break. You've tried everything, garlic prayers, tying a scrap of holy cloth around her wrist. Nothing works. You don't mention it. Your oldest son is already outside. You can hear him coughing as he tends the fire pit. He's only 10. but he works like a grown man has to. There's no one else. You grab a crust of bread from the table, if you can call it that. It's a flat board, resting on two uneven stumps. The bread is hard. You dip it in the leftover water to soften it. It doesn't help you chew anyway. The bread is made from barley, or maybe rye, mixed with whatever filler you had, peas, ground, or corns, even sawdust. It's baked once a week maybe, and the rest of the time it sits near the fire, growing harder by the hour. You glance at the small wooden icon on the wall, a crude carving of a saint whose name you don't know. You mumble a prayer. At least the rhythm of one Latin isn't your language, but the words feel sacred by sound alone. Maybe that's enough. A few moments of silence pass, then the rooster crows. Not yours, of course. You can't afford one. It's Edric's. It sounds smug. You stretch your back and hear it pop in 3 places. That's the morning song. You take a deep breath. The air smells like damp straw ash and unwashed wool. You feel the cold settle into your bones like an old friend. Time to start the day today. Like every day begins with wood without fire. There's no warmth, no cooking, no hope of boiling. The lice from your clothing. You grab a dull hatchet and trudge to the woodpile. You're not allowed to cut trees in the Lord's forest. Technically, even gathering fallen branches is illegal, but everyone does it. You just hope the steward isn't watching. The mud clings to your feet. The ground never really dries. Not in winter paths, or just grooves worn into the earth, churned to slurry by feet and hooves and cartwheels. You slip once and curse quietly. You don't want to wake the baby again later. You'll check the thatch, try to mend the fence, feed the pig, tend the plot. Maybe go to the village oven, if there's anything to bake, but first, would always you nod to your neighbor. He grunts in return. You both know this day already. You've lived it 100 times. The king wakes slowly, not from cold or pain or noise, but because that is the luxury of power. His bed is enormous, draped in velvet and lined with furs. The sheets are imported linen, so soft, they barely whisper as he turns. The mattress is filled with goose down. Not just any geese, mind you, ones raised specifically for Appalace. Their feathers are collected by hand. He doesn't open his eyes at first. There's no need. The room is already warm thanks to the fire that's been maintained through the night by a servant whose only duty is to keep it fed logs from the royal forest birch. Maybe your cedar, something that smells faintly sweet as it burns. A gentle knock. Then silence, another knock. Then the door opens slowly. A valet enters. He walks quietly, placing a pitcher of warm water beside the bed. Another servant follows with a warmed robe. A third holds a towel. Fourth holds his slippers. Each one bows in sequence like a slow-moving clock. This is routine. Every medieval court has one. The king does not rise alone. He is dressed, washed, tended to. Even the act of waking is political. Who is allowed into the room? Who speaks first? Who touches the king's garments? Protocol. Is everything. It reaffirms the natural order. The king stretches a servant, pulls back the curtains. Sunlight pours in, filtered through stained glass windows, in blues and reds. It pulls on the polished stone floor. The king yawns. He swings his legs over the bed. His feet never touch the ground. Slippers are sliding before he moves. The robe is draped over his shoulders. He doesn't lift a finger. He moves to the wash basin. The water is warm, perfumed with rose oil. A towel is held up for him as he pats his face dry. He examines himself in a polished silver mirror. Not bad. He thinks perhaps a bit pale. He sits. A servant trims his beard. Another combs his hair. A third applies a balm to his hands. A fourth lays out his clothing, a doublet embroidered with gold thread. Hose dyed a deep green. A cloak lined with man. And these are not just clothes. They are symbols. His garments are dyed with expensive plant-based pigments who matter saffron, each hue denoting wealth and power. Breakfast is being prepared. He can smell it. Fresh bread, honeyed figs, sausages, eggs. Something sweet, something savory. It will be laid out in the solaroon beside a fire, and beneath a tapestry of his grandfather slaying a boar. While he eats, he may hear poetry or music or scripture. He may receive guests, or he may not. The day's official matters can wait unless war has broken out, or a bishop has arrived unannounced. He hears a knock at the outer door, a steward with the morning briefing news from the border, a letter from the bishop, a request from a noble heir report on the grain stores. He waves it all away. Later he sits in the warmth and listens to a lute player softly plucking a tune outside the bells. Ring the hour. The sound is pleasant, faint. Untroubling the world beyond the walls does not concern him. Not yet. The king takes a sip of wine. Breakfast can wait for the medieval peasant. Breakfast was not a meal. It was a concession. A small pause between waking and working, a momentary comfort carved from the relentless pace of survival. It rarely came with ceremony, and it never came with choice. The half is barely lit, its fire still sulking. From the night before, you prow at the embers with a stick, and blow gently, your breath fogging in the air with luck and a bit of kindling that hasn't gone damp in the night. A flicker appears. You feed it carefully until it glows enough to warm the bottom of a clay pot balanced on the edge of a stone. Your hands hover near it, desperate to steal back the warmth the night took from you. There is notable, just a flat board across two stumps, already scorched in spots from balancing pots over open flame. You pull a wooden bowl from the shelf, not quite round-chipped at the lip, and ladle in a scoop of what might generously be called porridge. The recipe is simple water, some ground barley or oats, a pinch of salt when you can afford it. There's no milk your cow. If you had one, died last winter, and the village dairy supplies go mostly to the reef. The consistency of the porridge is closer to paste than soup. Lumpy gray with occasional husks of grain that crunch when they shouldn't. You tear off a hunk of dark, coarse bread, the kind made from a mix of barley, rye, and whatever else can be ground into flour. Wheat bread is for the nobility. White bread is a miracle you've never seen. This loaf is dense, heavy, and days old. You dip it into the hot mush, soften it enough to bite without breaking a tooth, and chew with the patience of someone who knows there's no alternative. Most peasants in medieval Europe began their day with something like this. The term breakfast wasn't even common until later, centuries instead. The morning bite was a continuation of last night's sustenance. The word itself, breaking the fast, implied there had been a fast to begin with. For peasants, the fast never really ended. Your children sit near you, rubbing sleep from their eyes, already coughing. One of them eats with two hands. The other just stares into the bowl. You tell them to eat slowly. Not because there's more coming, there isn't, but because it's better to stretch the illusion. Your wife drinks weak ale from a cracked wooden cup. It's thin, bitter, and lukewarm, but it's safer than water. The stream outside has a habit of killing chickens and children alike. Boiling takes fuel you don't always have, So the ale brewed from grain fermented, just enough to kill what the river carries becomes the drink of choice. Even at sunrise. Sometimes when luck align, breakfast includes an onion or leeks boiled with a bit of fat, scraped from the bottom of the meat barrel. But this morning there's no meat. The pig was slaughtered weeks ago. Its parts salted and hung in the rafters. Most of it went to the Lord, as was required by law attacks of flesh bone and survival. You hear your neighbor cough outside Edric again. He's already on his feet, already working. You envy his energy, or maybe you just envy his. Chickens he has 3, you have none. Someone knocks on the door, a soft rap. It's a child, muddy-faced, barefoot, asking if your wife has any herbs for her sister. You don't, but she'd find something anyway. Dried nettles, maybe, or wound you trade for it. Half a heel of bread split in silence. The sun climbs slowly, lightening the frost on the silly. You stand, stretch your back, and wipe your hands on your tunic. The bowl goes back to the shelf. The pot still, steaming faintly, is saved for later. Maybe for dinner. Maybe not, that was breakfast. And now there is work at the same hour in a palace. 50 menors and several universes away. Breakfast is also being served, but here it is not a necessity. It is a display. The king awakens in silk sheets, the smell of sweet wood smoke curling through the air from a fire that never dies. A steward appears to announce the meal, though the scents have already done the job. He is led into the solar aprivet sunlit room where tall windows spill light across painted walls and a floor covered in hand-woven rugs. From Moorish lands, the table is already set, silver platters lined with folded cloth napkins, carved wooden bowls glazed with colored enamel knives so polished they reflect the face of the man who holds them. No dish touches the table before being tasted by a food taster. The threat of poison is real, especially in times when political ambition is as common as thigh. Hunger, a loaf of soft white bread made from the finest. Sifted wheat flour rests beneath. A linen cover. This is manchet bread, prized for its purity, a luxury. Only the upper class can afford the fine saves and careful processing that turns ordinary grain into something this pale and delicate alongside it. Poached. Eggs from palace hens sprinkled with herbs from the castle's kitchen garden. Spiced sausages of venison and boar cured and smoked in ways peasants have only heard about. A bowl of figs, imported at cost from Iberia, or the Holy Land cut open to reveal their purple-red insides, honeycomb dripping onto cheese rich and soft, made from the milk of sheep raised on lands the king has never seen. He eats slowly, not because he is savoring the meal, but because he knows he can. There's no rush. A cup of me sits by his plate, gold-tinged and lightly scented with herbs. He drinks little of it. A servant waits with watered wine in case his mood changes. Breakfast for a king is as much about being seen as it is about eating attendance. Hover in silence, musicians. Pluck a slow tune in the corner. The steward reads aloud. The day's agenda: petitions from nobles, disputes over borders, supply concerns from the coast. The king listens with one ear, chewing on a slice of pear, poached in cinnamon. It is sweet. It is forgettable. Medieval royal meals were orchestrated events. Banquets and feasts were public, but even private meals followed. Rituals, certain dishes implied wealth and status. The more exotic the ingredients, the higher the status. Spices like cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg were imported at staggering prices through Venetian and Arab merchants. A single sack of pepper might be worth a cow. He finishes half the bread, a sliver of ham, and picks at a pastry filled with minced apples and dried cherries when he's had enough. He signals with a hand. The plates are cleared silently. A towel is brought for his fingers. He hasn't touched anything directly, but the gesture is expected. He resigns slightly, watching the dust float through the sunbeams. The servants step backward, in perfect rhythm. The king's dog, a thin greyhound with polished fur pads to his feet, and rests its head on his slipper. He absently strokes its ears. Breakfast is over. Not because he is full, but because he says so. One meal eaten for fuel, one for pleasure. One devoured to fight hunger. One consumed because it exists. The peasant scrapes the last grain from his bowl and drinks weak. The king throws away half a roasted partridge because it tasted slightly overdone. The average peasant consumed around 500 to 2,000 calories a day, when available mostly from bread and pottage. The average nobleman closer to 4,000 with far less physical labor to burn it. Gout, the disease of kings, wasn't metaphorical. Too much meat, too much wine, too little motion, but in the end, neither man truly wins. The peasant walks away, hungry to a day that will demand everything. The king walks away bored to a day that will offer everything and ask him to pretend it matters. And so they rise from their tables, both under the same rising sun, one stomach aching with emptiness, the other aching with fullness. Neither truly satisfied, you reach for your tunic. Not because it's clean, not because it's new, but because it's all you have. In medieval Europe, peasants didn't own wardrobes. They owned a garment, singular, maybe two. If the harvest had been particularly kind, one for work, one for sleeping, sometimes they were the same thing. Yours certainly are. It's made of roast-spun wool. The fiber's coarse enough to scratch your skin raw, if you're not careful. The color, something between mud and old straw. It was once a pale brown, but years of labor, smoke, and unwashed sweat have darkened it into anonymity. The sleeves are uneven. One is frayed at the cuff, the other patched with an old scrap from your wife's dress. No one will notice, no one cares underneath. If it's a good day, you might wear a linen shirt. Smoke is the proper term. But today is not a good day. It tore last week while you were hauling timber, and the tear opened, like a mouth across your side. You haven't had time to mend it. Besides, linen doesn't keep out the cold like wool does. Even if it's softer on the skin, you step into your hose. Not like the noble's finely woven. Stockings, yours are closer to long woolen tubes, tied at the knee, sagging at the ankle, and held up by sheer stubbornness. One of them has a hole in the heel. You've been meaning to stitch it shut. But every day it seems less important than getting through the next shoes. If you're lucky, maybe you own a pair old cracked leather with twine laces and soles that have more holes than hide. Most peasants went barefoot for half the year, especially during warmer seasons. In winter, scraps of cloth might be wrapped around the feet, or you simply walked carefully. Today you slip your feet into wooden clogs, crudely shaped and unforgiving, but better than frostbite. Your belt is rope. It used to be leather, but that cracked and snapped. The same year youngest was born, the rope is a better symbol of your station. Anyway, a looped, scratchy truth wrapped around your waist, no buttons, no zippers. Those are luxuries. Centuries, way your clothes are fastened with knots, wooden toggles, or nothing at all. The neckline of your tunic hangs open loose from years of wear. Your wife ties it closed with a bit of twine. She doesn't smile. Neither do you. There's nothing joyful about getting dressed when every stitch reminds you how close you are to nakedness. Medieval peasants had no closets, no drawers. Clothing hung from nails in the wall or was folded and placed in a chest. If you were fortunate enough to own one, lists were common companions. fleas too. You brush something off your sleeve and decide not to look too closely in some parts of Europe. Sumpta laws restricted what peasants could wear. Not that you were likely to offend those laws you couldn't afford. Fine colors, ordied fabrics. Even if you tried purple, scarlet, or gold, that would be illegal and laughable. You've never even seen gold thread. Your wife wears much the same a kind of dress. If you squint, made of scratchy wool tied at the waist with a cord. Her head is covered with a wimple. Not for fashion, but for warmth and modesty, her sleeves are rolled up. She's already working the children wear hand-me-downs so patched and mismatched they resemble scarecrows. The baby is swaddled in rags. There's a hole in one of them which you patch with more rag. The cycle continues. Getting dressed is not a transformation. It is not preparation. It is simply a layering of misery onto flesh. A small armor against the world, just thick enough to fool yourself into thinking it matters. But you wear it anyway, because to go out in nothing would be worse in the castle. The king's garments await him. Long before he opens, his eyes laid out by pages and valets. His clothing is carefully selected, inspected, and warmed by the fire, so that not even a thread feels chilled when it touches his skin. It begins not with the outer garments, but with the linen's soft, bleached white undercloth made of finely woven flax fibers. Only nobles could afford such softness. The peasants grow the flax. The king wears it first. A shirt long-sleeved, smooth, almost weightless. It smells faintly of lavender dried and stored among the folds by servants whose names he doesn't know. Over that hose snug-fitting woolen garments that cover his legs from ankle to thigh. These are dyed a deep blue a color, expensive to produce, extracted from wed, and reserved for those of means over. The hose he is helped into a doublet, a padded tailored jacket that buttons down the front with small discs of bone or polished horn. The buttons are decorative as much as functional, unlike the peasant. The king wears buttons not because he must, but because he can. Buttons are a mark of craftsmanship, proof of tailoring, a symbol of class stitched into the seams. His cloak today is velvet, dyed of rich burgundy, lined with man fur. The cloak drapes from his shoulders and trails slightly on the floor. A servant tucks it just so to avoid dust on his feet. Soft leather boots made by the castle quarter fitted exactly to his size and shape. They have never touched mud. A sash of silk is tied around his waist. Its ends embroidered with the symbol of his house. Silk is imported from Byzantium and the East. It travels through trade routes guarded by mercenaries and balanced on the backs of camels. It arrives here at great cost. He doesn't think about that. He just likes the way it drapes. Jewelry is optional, but customary: a ring or two, a brooch, a clasp set with semi-precious stones. These are not for security or beauty. They are reminders to everyone in his presence that his body is sacred, adorned, elevated. While he dresses, attendants discuss the weather, his agenda, who might be arriving for court. Someone mentions a visiting dignitary. Another whispers about grain prices. It's all background noise. He nods, occasionally raises an eyebrow, but doesn't respond. He is busy being dressed. The final item, a circlet, not quite a crown, but enough to remind everyone who he is, not too heavy. This is mourning. Where not a state occasion, getting dressed for the king is not merely about function or even comfort. It is a performance, a layering of power, thread by thread. His clothes are stitched not just to warm him, but to separate him from the world, to make it clear that he is not of the same cloth. And when he steps into the hall, robes, trailing hands, ringed boots, spotless, everyone who sees him understands the truth. This is not a man. This is a symbol, and symbols are always well dressed. One man dresses in a single wool tunic, patched beyond recognition. The other is wrapped in layers of tailored elegance. The peasant gets dressed while standing shivering beside a smoky half. The king is dressed by others, warmed by the fire he never has to feed. But both beneath it all are still just men, one clothed in discomfort, the other in performance. One wrapped in survival, the other wrapped in image, both bound by thread, though only one can afford to ignore the seams you step. Outside and the cold hits like a slap. The door swings on tired hinges and there is sharp enough to sting the inside of your nose. You squint into the early light. The sun isn't up yet. Not really. Just a pale smear on the horizon, your breath clouds in front of you like smoke. You don't need a clock to know the time, your bones do that for you. The yard is a mess of frozen ruts and old straw chickens peck lazily near the woodpile, one of them, eyes limping. You make a mental note to check its leg later. You won't. There's no time. Your day begins not with a plan, but a list of obligations stacked like firewood. Uneven, unstable, always about to topple. First, you check the animals. The pig is rooting. Through what remains of the compost pile, its eyes follow you wearily, like it knows it's next on the menu. If winter doesn't ease up, it's probably right. You refill its trough with scraps, turnip skins, old leaves, and a few spoonfuls of yesterday's porridge, crusted. Onto the side of the pot the pig eats with more energy than you'll have all day. The firewood pile is low again. You grab the axe from its spot, against the wall, the handle smooth from use, the blade nicked and dulled. You trudge toward the tree and feet, sinking slightly into frozen mud. You've been harvesting from the same grove all winter each day. You go a little farther, and each swing of the axe feels heavier than the last. You gather what you can. Carry broken branches, bark, even damp twigs. Everything. Burns if you're desperate enough. You haul it back in bundles on your back. No sled, no cart nominal. Just you stack it, half haphazardly near the door. It won't last a week. Then water, always water. You walk to the stream with a bucket in each. Hand the water is clearer than it should be. A bad sign that means fewer fish. Fewer frogs. You draw it up in silence. You slip once on the icy stones, and your knee slams into the mud. You swear under your breath the water sloshes. One bucket spills, you don't. Refill it. You just go home. Back at the hut, your wife is spinning wool by the hearth. The children are up now, huddled near as a fire, watching. Her fingers work the spindle with slow practice movements. The baby cries, she doesn't. Stop spinning, you change. Into your working tunic, the one with fewer holes near the knees, and wrap a cloth around your head. There's work waiting in the Lord's field. There's always work, and always for someone else's benefit. You walk the mile to the memorial land shoulders, hunched hands and sleeves. Others walk beside you, men. You know, men. You don't talk to. Conversation is a luxury for men with energy. You save your breath for labor. Today's duty is muck spreading the stench. Is overwhelming, you breathe through your mouth and try not to gag, you shovels. Lowly, methodically spreading dung across frozen soil in the name of future fertility. You don't ask how much you'll be paid. You won't be. This is part of your feudal obligation. Core of labor. You owe the Lord. So many days. A year, and today is one of them. You'll get a nod. Maybe some leftover grain. If he's feeling generous, you won't complain. You've seen what happens to men who do in the medieval memorial system. Peasants were expected to work their lord's lands in addition to tending their own. The balance was impossible. Your own plot withers while you sow his wealth. But to protest is to starve by Midday. Your hands are raw. Your legs tremble. You've relieved yourself behind a tree and wiped with leaves. Your stomach groans. Lunch is whatever you brought: a crust of bread, a clove of garlic, a slice of dried turnip wrapped in cloth. You chew slowly, seated on a rock, watching the Lord's reeve ride by. On horseback, his boots shine. Your knees are stained with filth. You finish eating. There is more work. There is always more. The king's duties begin in the great hall. Long after the servants have finished setting it in order. Tall windows, spill-colored light across, polished floors, and the air is fragrant with herbs scattered to mask the smell of too many bodies in too little space. A scribe stands ready with a scroll. The steward approaches, bowing low. The first item on the agenda is a petition from a noble family, requesting permission to build a new mill. The king listens, then gestures. Let the advisors argue. He'll decide once they've worn themselves out. He settles into the high-back chair, not quite a throne, but elevated nonetheless, and sips wine from a goblet, carved with a royal crest. His robe is thick velvet, his fingers heavy with rings. A clear begins reading aloud the list of grievances from the local burghers. The taxes are too high. The roads are impossible. Bandits stalk the woods. Again, the king nods occasionally. Mostly he thinks about lunch. A messenger arrives from the northern border. There's trouble as always. The baron is late with his levies. The peasants there have been refusing to work. He asks if soldiers should be dispatched. The king raises an eyebrow. Only if the harvest is in Hemmermers. The medieval king was not always a tyrant. His days were often consumed with small grinding details, managing trade routes, hearing disputes, confirming marriages, ensuring vassals remained loyal. His power was vast, but not absolute. Even a king needed to maneuver through politics, through custom, through the church. A priest approaches with a sealed letter from the bishop. More concerns about heresy in the southern shires. A wandering preacher has been stirring up unrest. The king sighs. He'll let the Inquisition deal with that. The court jester interrupts with a joke. No one laughs until the king smirks. Then the room erupts with polite chuckles. He listens to a minstrel perform a new ballad, half paying attention, while his steward quietly counts out expenses from the last feast. The numbers are high. No one questions it. Then come the petitions from the commoners. A farmer with a broken fence and a neighbor with aggressive geese, a baker arguing with a brewer about grain prices. The king listens for a moment, then waves them away. Let the reeves sort it. A hunting party is scheduled for the afternoon. He looks forward to that, a break from the talking. But for now, here turns to his chamber to review. Letters, his own seal, his own wax, his own ink, made from oak galls and iron salts. He doesn't write them. Of course, he dictates. The scribe's job is to translate the king's words into something dignified. One letter to a cousin in France, another to the Pope, a third to a mistress in a border town. By late morning, he's spoken to 30 men, heard 20 grievances, signed 15 scrolls, and decided very little. But his presence is enough. He is king, and kings above all must be seen. One man begins his day by shoveling manure, the other by shuffling papers. One earns nothing and owes everything. The other owns everything and earns nothing yet. Both play their roles in a kingdom that demands performance. The peasant labors under the weight of his body. The king labors under the weight of his title. One cannot rest, the other cannot. Hide the peasant duties, draw blood. The king's draw ink, you wake up, already unclean. There's no moment of freshness, no scent of soap, no warm water on the face dirt. Lives with you, not just under your nails or on your skin, but in your mattress, in your clothes, in your food, and sometimes in your blood. You don't notice it anymore, or rather you notice it constantly, and there's just nothing to do about it. There's a bucket in the corner of your hut. It's filled with gray water, the same used yesterday to rinse a bowl or wash your child's feet. You splash your hands into it, then rub your face. It's shockingly cold. You blink, your skin tightens. You feel more awake, but not cleaner. Soap is rare when it exists. It's made from lye and animal fat, coarse and stinging, and kept for special occasions. Your wife used the last of it weeks ago to wash linens before the saints' feast. She still has the blisters you wipe your hands on your tunic, which is already soiled at the waist from firewood ash and pig feet. Doesn't matter. You smell like sweat and smoke and old wool. So does everyone else. Medieval peasants didn't bathe it often. Not because they didn't want to, but because there was little opportunity, no plumbing, no privacy. Water had to be carried bucket by bucket from streams or wells heating. It meant burning precious firewood. The result? A full bath happened. Maybe a few times a year, more often, in summer less. In winter, you couldn't waste warmth. The church preached cleanliness of the soul, not the body. Some monks bathed, but for the average laborer. A wash meant a quick splash of cold water on the face. And hands, you've heard rumors of Roman baths, ancient places of steam and marble, but they sound more like fairy tales than history. You pick at the dirt in your fingernails. It's a pointless ritual. You'll be kneed in soil within the hour. Anyway, your feet are cracked, your knuckles chapped. You have a rash on your leg that hasn't gone away. You think it might be ringworm or just irritation from your hose rubbing the same spot every day. Your wife combs the children's hair. With her fingers, you see a louse. She crushes it with a thumbnail and keeps going. The toilet is a pit behind. The hut, half covered with old wood planks. In winter, it's frozen and dangerous. You squat beside it instead. Everyone does. No one speaks of it. Public latrines exist in larger towns, but they overflow. Chamber pots are dumped into the street you've seen. Someone throw waste from a window and yell, "Gotta loo!" A crude French warning to clear the path. You didn't move fast enough tooth care, you chew on a mint sprig. If you can find one, some folks use cloth to scrub with ashes. Most just lose their teeth. Before 40, you run your tongue along your murse and feel one wiggle, you spit, and there's blood again. The village healer, not a doctor, just an old woman with herbs, told you to drink nettle tea. It didn't help. She also said to sleep with a toad under your pillow. You didn't try that one. Disease is constant. Boils, fevers, coughs that never quite go away. One of the neighbor's sons died last week. Fever and vomiting. They said might have been bad meat, order, water, or God's will. You check the baby's forehead. Still warm. Not burning, but not right. Your wife hasn't said anything, but you see the fear in her eyes. You know people who carry dried herbs in pouches around the necks to keep away miasma's bad air. The priest says, illness is a punishment. The healer says, it's the weather. You say nothing. What's the point? Your neighbor claims he went 6 years without getting sick. Then his foot turned black. He died 3 days. Later you dunk your head in the water. Trough to rinse your hair. It doesn't help you smell like a man who works for a living. You always will, and still you go on because there's no alternative. The king wakes not to filth but to fragrance. His chambers are swept twice daily by servants using bundles of herbs thyme. Rosemary, lavender scattered. Across the stone floors, they don't just freshen the air. They're believed to ward off illness. Clean smells, they say, make for a clean body. He sits beside a basin of warm water. A servant dips a cloth, wrings it carefully, and wipes the king's face and neck. Another dabs at his hands. The water is infused with rose petals, orange blossoms, sometimes vinegar. It smells like luxury, unlike peasants. The king does not carry his own water, nor does he walk to the bathhouse. The bath comes to him in the form of a large wooden tub lined with linen sheets filled with heated water poured from brass pitchers. He bathes when he wishes, sometimes once a week, sometimes daily. It's his choice. Soap is not just available, its imported bars come from Castile, made with olive oil and lie scented with citrus or pine. It laves softly. It does not sting. The king's skin is pampered with oils afterward to prevent dryness. Almond oil, if it's in stock. Goose fat. If not, he is rubbed with cloths made of fine linen. His hair is brushed with a bristle brush, his nails trimmed with care, checked for signs of illness. Cleanliness for royalty is not merely comfort. It's an extension of health, of status, of godliness. His physician's university trained perhaps in Paris or Salerno believe. The body has 4 humors: blood phlegm, yellow bile, black bile, balance, ischy. They advise the king to avoid dampness, excess wind-spoiled food. He has pulled periodically to restore equilibrium. He follows a regimen known as regimen sanitas. Rules for healthy living: moderate food, rest, gentle movement, fresh air, no overexertion. The body, they say, must be tended like a garden. His teeth are cleaned with a cloth dipped in wine or vinegar, sometimes ashes or crushed herbs. He rinses with sage-infused water. Bad breath, the doctor says, can signal internal decay. He listens, even if he finds it. Tedious illness is still a threat. Of course, even kings get fevers, even kings die of the plague. But when he falls ill, he is surrounded by care, pickuses, prayers leeches, tinctures brewed in silver pots when he coughs. 5 men listen during outbreaks. The king retreats to the countryside, to the coast. Anywhere but. The city, he closes the gates. No visitors. The poor. In the streets, he reads about it in letters he hears. Tales of entire towns falling ill, entire villages vanishing. He commisses a prayer, a mass, a candle to be lit, and he dines as usual. Cleanliness to him is visible, it is scented, it is symbolic, and above all, it is managed by others. The peasant scrapes the mud from his heels with a stick. The king scrapes the dirt from his nails with ivory. The peasant smells of animals, ash, and labor. The king smells of citrus and rose water. One body is raw from cold water and coarse wool. The other is cradled by steam and silk, but both in the end bleed, both when cut scar, both when struck by plague, fall the same way, and death, whether in a straw bed or a gilded chamber, does not care for soap leisure. For you is a strange word. It sounds like something for other people's softer lives, softer hands. You don't have leisure. You have pauses, gaps in labor where your body aches too much to move, and your thoughts shuffle through boredom and pain. Still, even the lowest peasant finds a way to break the monotony, because if all you ever do is work, eventually you forget why you bother to survive at all. the first and most common form of entertainment talking, not idle gossip. Although that exists, but story tales told by the firelight when the work is done. When the children have quieted and the pot is empty, you don't own a book. You can't read, and neither can anyone else you know. But you've heard stories passed down from your grandfather about saints, demons, dragons, and long-dead kings. Some tales are morality. Fables, others are barely held together. Nonsense about animals who outwit the devil. All are told slowly, dramatically, with long pauses and widened eyes. They don't have to make sense. They just have to make you forget your hunger. The village also entertains, itself with song not in melodies you'd find in a cathedral, but sharp rhythmic chants, simple lyrics easy to remember, often lewd, always local. You know a dozen that mention someone in your hamlet. By name you sing while you work. Sometimes not because it's fun, but because it helps the time pass. Festivals, when they happen, are the height of joy. The church calendar provides structure, feast days, saints' days, holy days. These are your sanctioned excuses to stop laboring to drink, to dance, to gather in the square with others, and pretend the year isn't dragging its weight across your back during the feast of Saint Martin. The villagers roast what meat they can spare you. Once saw a pig's head carried on a platter, its eyes replaced with onions. Children danced around it. Someone juggled turnips. You drank too much ale and vomited behind the church. It was the best night of your year. Games exist too. No boards, no tokens, just rock sticks and imagination. You've played Catch the Goose, a game that mostly involves chasing a terrified bird across a field while people laugh. You've bet on who can lift the biggest log. You've watched grown men wrestle in the mud, for nothing but pride and scratches sometimes. A traveling performer passes through a juggler puppet, show a man with a monkey who does tricks for coin. You watched one swallow fire once. You're still not sure how he survived. You didn't have a penny to give him, but you stood in the mud for an hour and watched in silence. And then, of course, there's ale week, cloudy sour, brewed in barrels that have never been cleaned, served in mugs that have never been washed. But it works. It dulls the edge on a good night. You sit with neighbors nursing the drink and listening to someone attempt a dirty joke that's too long and poorly told. You laugh anyway, not at the joke, for drunkenness isn't frowned upon. Exactly as expected, your Lord drinks too. The priest may warn against excess, but even. He accepts a cup during feast days. You've danced in the dirt, barefoot with someone else's wife. You've sung songs you don't remember. You've fallen asleep under a tree and woken up with leaves in your mouth. It isn't much, it's barely anything, but for a few hours, it's enough for the king. Entertainment is an institution, an extension of power, taste, and spectacle. It isn't simply about enjoyment, it's about control, presentation, dominance of boredom itself each day. The king has choices: music, sport, hunting, dining, or the theater of politics, each a stage upon which he performs his identity as ruler in the late morning. A minstrel plays in the solar lute, harp, flute. Trained hands plucking chords, composed to soothe or flatter. The melodies are composed by professionals, copied by scribes, and performed by those who know their lives depend on the king's reaction. He listens idly. Sometimes he closes his eyes, not out of appreciation, but out of boredom. Then he waves a hand and says, "Enough." The room empties later. He walks in the gardens. These aren't wild hedgerows like they outside the peasant's hut. They are curated spaces, ornamental herbs, sculpted topes, fountains imported from Italy. Everything arranged to remind him of order, his order. He plays chess with a visiting noble. The board is made of inlaid ivory and lapis, The pieces are hand-carved. The game is long, slow, half conversation, half test. He wins because he must. The noble doesn't mind. He was never trying to win anyway in the afternoon. He hunts. The royal hunt is not a necessity. It's not about feeding the court. It's theater. He mounts his horse bred for stamina and speed, wearing a leather doublet, gloves stitched with his crest hawks, ride on gloved fists, hounds run ahead. Horns sound, the forest clears. For him the animals are driven toward him by beaters, peasants with sticks shouting, and stomping through a brush when the deer appears. He loses his arrow if he hits. It is a great shot. If he misses it, was a great shot. That narrowly missed. The record will reflect it either way. At the end of the hunt, there is a feast. The boar is roasted. Whole game birds are dressed in their own feathers. Wine flows freely. This is not survival. This is abundance, a display of divine favor. The medieval king's court often included jesters, acrobats, storytellers, and even magicians. These performers were well trained. Many traveling across kingdoms, a single misstep, a poorly told joke, an insult taken too far could mean exile or worse. But if they succeeded, they might die near nobility, gain patronage, or receive a gift of land. He watches a performance. A troupe enacts a play from a distant city, perhaps Paris or Prague. The themes are familiar: betrayal, honor. God he applauds at the end. Even if he barely followed the plot, the hall echoes with approval. No one asks if he enjoyed it. In the evening, he may read not aloud. That is for clerks, but he listens to books, being read to him tales of ancient Rome, romances of knights and maidens, treatises on theology. He asks questions occasionally, not always expecting answers. Then music. Again, then a warm bath. Then sleep. Entertainment is not rare for him. It is constant, and yet he is often bored. The peasant laughs because it might be the only joy he feels all week. The king laughs because it's expected. One dances in the dirt in bare feet to the rhythm of a friend slapping a barrel. The other dances in a hall gilded and perfumed to strings and harps. One sings to forget the hunger. The other listens to singers to fill the silence. The peasant waits all year for a single feast day. The king feasts every day and longs for something new. Yet both in their own way seek the same thing, to forget for a moment what they are. You wake hungry again. You went to bed with hunger sitting in your gut like a stone, and it's still there, just dulled by sleep. The idea of being full feels like a memory from another life. Maybe you were full once, a festival day, a neighbor's wedding, but most mornings, like this one, your stomach starts out quiet and gets louder by the hour. You steer the pot hanging over the half. It's yesterday's pottage, still warm from the coals, thick like glue and brown like mud. Bits of barley, a turnip, chunk a wilted leaf. You ladle a scoop into your bowl. There's not much left, so you give the bigger share to your eldest child. He doesn't thank you. He just eats like a dog that doesn't want to be seen. Pottage is what you eat. Morning, evening, sometimes cold in the middle of the day, if there's enough to spare. There's no recipe. It's whatever you have boiled for hours until it can't be picked apart. Barley and oats are common, sometimes beans, peas, leeks. If you're lucky, a scrap of fatback or a bone for flavor. Usually not bread is next. If there's any, yours is black and hard, made from rye and barley grains that grow better in poor soil. The kind you farm, The flour is mixed with water and salt. If you have it, then baked into rounds or flat cakes in the communal oven, if you remembered your place. In line, there's grit in the breadstone. Ground flour always leaves a bit behind, and it wears your teeth down year by year. Your mirrors feel dull now. One is starting to crack. You chew anyway. Slowly, carefully, you drink ale. Everyone does not the strong stuff. What you have is weak and cloudy, more like fermented grain tea than anything intoxicating. But it's safer than the river. The well went bad last month, and you still remember the sick child who didn't make it. Boiling water takes firewood, and firewood takes hours. Ale, meat is rare. Maybe once a month you buy a scrap from the tanner. A cut too fatty to cure or too bruised to store. You boil it with roots and pretend it's a feast. Sometimes your neighbor traps a rabbit, you pretend not to notice. Hunting's forbidden. Unless you're a noble. The punishment for poaching a deer is death for a rabbit, a beating for a swan. You don't want to know your pigs are gone, sold off after the last frost, destroyed. The root cellar chickens are easier to keep, but they don't lay in winter. You used to trade eggs for cheese. Now you just eat the eggs when there are. Any cheese is a summer luxury. Milk turns too quickly this time of year. On holy days, there's more to eat. Saints, feasts, harvest, festivals, weddings. These are the times you remember with your eyes closed. Bread stuffed with onions, roasted goose-baked apples, dripping with honey. It doesn't last, but it burns into memory. You've told your children stories of the last Makemas feast, as if it were legend some peasants barter with their produce. You trade leeks for butter, cabbages for fish. The fish is salted rough on the tongue but keeps well. You once found a coin at the roadside and bought a fig at market. One figure you sliced it in 4 and let your children each have a piece. They still talk about it. Your food doesn't travel. Nothing comes from farther than a day's walk. You don't know what olives are. You've never seen a lemon. Spices area. Room or pepper for princes you flavor with herbs. You grow yourself thyme, a mustard leaf, horseradish root you salt. When you can. More often you don't. Your wife cooks. She stirs, strains, kneads, and lifts pots that steam her face. Red, her hands are always red and cracked. Your eldest daughter helps scraping pots, and tending the fire meals are more work than reward. You eat in silence or with quiet murmurs. No time for talk. You eat to finish. And when it's done, you thank God. Whether you mean it or not. Then you go back to work. The king eats whenever he chooses, or rather whenever the schedule of the court allows him to be fed with ceremony. Meals are more than nourishment here. They are theater statements, a feast not just for his guests, but for the idea of monarchy itself. His food is prepared in vast kitchens beneath the castle. Whole departments exist to coordinate the supply of game fish, vegetables, spices, bread, and wine. There are master cooks, assistants, pastry makers, poulters, fish, mongers, sauce chefs, spit turners, butterers, cupbearers, and food tasters. Each has a rank. Some have apprentices. Many serve for life bread. Arrives first white and soft, made of wheat, grown on royal estates and sifted through fine cloth. This is minette bread made only for the rich. It's served warm sliced, thin by a specialist. He carries the knife like a knight might carry. Assward next come meats, spit roasted balls, larded hares, herbed venison, wild birds, cooked in wine and cloves. There are pies with layered fillings, pigeon pear dates, envy each crust, sealed and stamped with a royal crest. Everything smells of spice, nutmeg, ginger, cinnamon, saffron. Spice is more expensive than gold. The king does not eat from wooden bowls. His dishes are put silver or gilded ceramicus. Goblets are etched glass or ornate metal, often studded with stones. Head drinks wine from Aquitaine. Cyprus Burgundy, imported by merchants who bribe their way into court favor. There is fish, always fish. Even on meat days, salted sturgeon eels in almond milk. Baked trout garnished with violets on Fridays. And fast days when meat is forbidden by church law. The cooks become even. More inventive whale meat is considered fish by decree. So is beaver tail. So are frogs. A theologian once argued that barnacle geese born of driftwood were also fish feasts. Our long 3, sometimes 4 hours each course ends with an entra, a kind of edible entertainment. A model castle made of pastry. A roasted peacock redressed in. Its feathers set ablaze with brandy. A pie that when opened releases live birds. Into the hall the king eats little of each dish. A few bites a taste he's notating. For hunger he's eating for demonstration. His physicians monitor his consumption carefully. He is advised according to the theory of the 4 humors balance between hot, cold, wet, and dry. Roast beef is hot and dry. Fresh apples are cold and moist food. Must be chosen with care lest it unbalance the king's body or worse. His mind, sometimes he is bled before a meal. Sometimes he fasts. Sometimes he indulges. But always the meal is recorded, chronicled, observed if guests are present. And they often are. They watch the king eat first. They do not begin until he does. They are served less lavish versions of his dishes. They watch his face for signs did he like. The quail was the sauce too. Sharp should they compliment the chef after the meal. His hands are washed in rose water by attendants. A perfumed cloth is offered. A minstrel plays. A servant recites a list of expenses incurred. And then with a nod, he stands. The meal is over. The performance is complete. The peasant eats scraps and roots and salt. The king eats peacocks and pears in wine. The peasant prays for enough. The king prays it's not overdone. The peasant eats what he can find. The king chooses what others search for. But both under wool or velvet, in drafty huts or gilded halls must eat. Both rely on others, one on the land, the other on men. Neither can live without the hands that grow, gather, kill, and cook. The difference is who gets to rest afterwards. You wake with the name of a saint on your lips. You're not sure which one there are. Too many Saint Cathbot. Saint Isidore, the one your wife prays to, for healthy births, or the one your neighbor swears healed his cow's leg. They blurt, together their images are painted badly on wood, or carved in the stone at the chapel. Flat eyes and bent fingers, holding books, staffs or babies. They all look tired. You feel the same. Religion is not something you think about. It's something you live inside, like the weather, like the mud. You cross yourself before you eat. You mumble prayers before bed. You know, the Lord's Prayer. Though half the words don't mean anything to you. You know the creed. You know that Sunday is for church. And that missing it gets you noticed. You know the priest smells like wine and speaks in Latin, a language you do not understand. The priest reads from his book with a voice like a chance rising and falling like the wind in the eaves. You nod, you kneel, you stand, you sit. You say Amen. It's all by rhythm, like a dance you never learned but have done all your life. The church is cold, always stone walls, no fire, just candles, a rough altar, and the echo of old prayers. You sit on a bench and think about your chores. You don't mean to. You just do. The church tells you what to eat and when to fast. It tells you when to mourn and when to celebrate. There are dozens of feast days, but most of them mean kneeling more, not eating more on Fridays. You don't eat meat during Lent, you eat less. Of everything, Advent is for waiting, Easter is for singing. Christmas is for huddling close to the fire. The priest is not poor. He has a servant, a fat goose, and shoes without holes. He doesn't till the soil, but he talks about sin with the confidence of someone who's never had to lie for a crust of bread. Still you listen, he buries your dead. He blesses your fields. He might even know your name. When things go wrong, when a child is born sick, or a cow refuses to milk, or the weather turns against, you look for meaning, for punishment, for sin, for someone to blame. You tie herbs above the door, light a candle, leave a coin at the chapel. You mutter to St. Bridget or St. Blay One or St. Jude. You aren't sure which one helps. With fever, you try them all. You've heard of people who stopped going to Mass. They vanished or starved or had their thatch catch fire in. The night you don't test those stories. Superstition isn't separate from faith. It's just the part the priest doesn't talk about. Your wife hangs charms over the cradle your neighbor buries. Nails at the corner of his field. You carry a bone in your pouch just in case the seasons change with the saints. Michaelmas brings, the harvest Candlemas starts, the 4 Midsummer's Eve is a night for fire and fear. When spirits walk and old magic stirs. You've jumped over the fire with bare feet. You've thrown salt into the ashes. You've whispered things you wouldn't dare say aloud. There's a woman outside the village, an herbalist, maybe more some say. She's a witch. Others say she's just clever. You went to her once when your youngest was sick. She gave you a sack of dried nettles and told you to burn it while singing. You did. The fever broke. The next day, coincidence, God. Her. You'll never know. That's the point. You believe. Because belief is what keeps you sane, because it gives shape to fear. Because if you don't believe, what's left? Just cold, just hunger, just death. So you believe, even when you doubt, you believe. The king prays too, but his prayers are written by others in the chapel attached to the royal palace. He kneels on cushions surrounded by marble and stained glass. He holds a prayer book, a psalter illuminated in gold and crimson, with saints drawn in miniature. The words are in Latin, but he has been taught them since childhood. He knows when to bow, when to pause, when to look solemn. His faith is not just personal. It is political. Monarchs in medieval Europe ruled by divine rights, their authority sanctioned by God, their power confirmed by coronation and anointing. To doubt the king was to doubt heaven itself. The king has confessors, bishops, and chaplain. He speaks with archbishops about church lands, tithes, theological debates. He funds monasteries and orders mass for the souls of his ancestors, heap points clerics. He consults with Rome. He does not question doctrine, he shapes it. He observes holy days with ceremony. Easter, Christmas, Corpus Christi. The palace fills with clergy. Incense. Chant meals are altered penances, assigned gifts, offered to shrines. The performance is elaborate and necessary, but the king's religion is not always about belief. It's about structure, about order. The church records births, marriages, deaths. It legitimizes rule. It grants approval. It threatens excommunication. For the king, the church is an institution, a partner and a rival, a mirror of his own power. Still, he believes in his own way. He believes because the system would collapse if he didn't. He believes in divine order, in moral duty, in eternal reward, and yet he too fears what lives. Outside the liturgy, he fears omens, eclipses, comets, strange births. He fears. Prophecy dreams the muttering of madmen. He wears relics under his cloak, a saint's tooth, a splinter from the true cross. His armor has a cross etched inside the breastplate. He believes it protects him. He consults astrologers. He reads horoscopes. His advisors tell him which days to travel and which to void before battle. He fasts. He hears Mass. He takes communion. He believes it will turn the tide when plague strikes. He orders public prayers. He funds processions. He closes the city gates. He retreats to the countryside. He commisses masses for the dead. Thousands of names read aloud. Night after night he has seen what faith looks like in desperation. He has seen villagers fog themselves in the street, begging God to spare them. He has seen men weep in front of statues. He has seen the bones of saints carried through mud. He believes, but he does not trust. He rules the body of the realm. The church claims the soul, and both know that if one crumbles, the other soon follows. The peasant clutches a wooden cross and whispers a desperate prayer. The king kisses a jeweled crucifix and signs a royal decree. One lights a candle for luck, the other funds. A cathedral one is told that suffering brings salvation. The other is told that power confirms holiness. Yet both fear the same silence after death. Both kneel in different places on different floors, wearing different clothes, but both pray to the same God, and both hope they are being heard. You wake before the light, not from a rooster's crow. He's late as usual, but from the sound of your joints cracking as you roll upright on a straw mattress that smells of mildew and years of sweat. You rub your eyes, try to remember if today is your turn to haul water, or your son's, and reach for the same coarse tunic you wore yesterday and the day before you're not free. That's not something you say out loud. It's not a thought you entertain often, but it lingers in your ribs, in your hands, in the rhythm of your life. You are a serf bound to the land, not a slave, not in name, but near enough that the difference hardly matters. Your Lord owns the ground beneath your feet. You simply borrow its surface. One furrow at a time, today's labor is predictable muck. The stalls collect firewood repair. A fence flattened in the storm tomorrow. It might be threshing grain in the manor's barn or filling a barrel of Aletto. The Reeveses' house or helping with the sheep work does not rotate with fairness, only with need, and need never sleeps. Each season comes with its own torment. Spring is planting endless hours hunched over rows of soil, pushing seeds into earth still clinging to. Winter's chill summer means harvest, and your fingers blister as you reap barley and hay until your tunic clings to you with sweat. Autumn is the rush to preserve salting meat, storing apples, bottling what little beer you've brewed before it spoils. And winterize endurance cold seeps in through the thatch and into your bones. You wake stiff and hungry, go to sleep, hungrier still. Most days you eat bread, not the white loaves of the rich, but dark, dense barley bread, fleck with grit from the millstone, pottage if you're lucky, a stew of whatever you've managed to find, or grow leeks, turnips, beans, a strip of bacon. If you're blessed, ale instead of water, because water might kill you. You have no tools of your own. just what's passed down or shared. A wooden plow with a cracked handle, a hoe tied with twine. A cart with one good wheel. If something breaks, you fix it, or you don't, and make dough anyway. Under feudal law, you overlord between 2 and 5 days of labor each week, depending on your agreement. This is called corv labor, and it's not optional. You work his land before your own. You mend his fences, repair his road, harvest his grain only afterward. If time and daylight allow, do you tend to your own meager strip of soil? If you protest, you risk punishment. If you falter, your isk starvation. And then there are the taxes. You pay a tithe to the church. 1/10 of everything you grow. If your harvest is bad, the tithe remains the same. The priest doesn't farm, but he eats well. You also owe ballets, or fees for using the Lord's mill, his oven, his press. Nothing is free, even boiling water might require. Permission. Your wife labors just as hard. She spins, bakes, cleans, tends animals, nurses children, and still finds time to mend your socks. There's no rest for her, either nor for your children, the moment they can lift a bucket or shoe a goose. They work. No one asks you what you want to be when you grow up. You already are what you will be: a worker of land, a servant of someone else's estate, a man, defined by how long his back can hold out. But sometimes there's a quiet joy. You finish digging a new furrow and step back to admire its line. You patch the roof with thatch that stays dry. During the next rain, you build a chicken coop from scrap wood and watch your children gather eggs with giddy smiles. It's no ambition. It's not pride, but it's yours. You might think Aching's life is idle, that he lies in silk, is fed by servants, drifts from banquet to banquet. That's true some of the time. But ruling is work, different work. Yes, but work all the same. He wakes surrounded by functionaries, a chamberlain, a squire, a confessor, a groom of the stool. Every movement is observed. Every word carries weight. He is expected to be the embodiment of divine order, the cornerstone of a realm stitched together by loyalty and law. His day begins with counsel. The royal household is a bureaucracy. Treasurers count coin. Stewards manage land, scribes track correspondence. The king listens as they list problems, border disputes, unpaid taxes, bad harvests, rebellious barons. He must decide what to do. His decision becomes law. He spends hours holding courts. Some of it, ceremonial nights, seeking titles, nobles pledging fealty. Some of it, judicial cases of land theft, marriage, disputes, accusations of treason. His presence alone influences. The outcome, one raised eyebrow, can sway a sentence. Kings are also diplomats. He arranges marriages like chess, moves one daughter to seal peace with a Ragan, a nephew sent to marry a distant duchess. Alliances made not with treaties, but with bloodlines. He governs warfare too. In times of peace, he trains, reviews armories, sends funds to fortify castles, approves levy rosters in times of war. He commands directly or through trusted generals. Many medieval kings ride to battle themselves. Some die there. His signature controls currency, a decree to mint more silver coins or to debase the currency slightly. Ripples across trade. Networks. He must think like a banker, a warlord, and a priest, all while keeping the nobles happy and the peasants quiet. Even feasts are work. He sits at the center, radiant with wealth, a living symbol of stability. His food is inspected, his wine poured by protocol. Every bite is a message. To eat too much is gluttony. Too little ingratitude he meets with bishops, abbots, and papliats. The church is both ally and rival. The king may fund monasteries and cathedrals, but he's also wary of Rome's influence. A single excommunication can undermine his throne, sometimes in a quiet hour. The king reads or listens too. A clerk read aloud books of law, chronicles religious texts. He must be informed. Ignorance is weakness. He must also project health. A weak king invites rebellion. So he rides, he hunts, he leads possessions, he is seen. Visibility is a kind of labor, exhausting, unending. Even his sleep is guarded. His dreams not fully his own. He doesn't dig ditches, but he holds a realm together, and that's no small task. The peasants' hands are calloused from earth. The king's are calloused from decisions. One sweats in the fields. The other sweats in the throne room. One's misstep means hunger. The other's misstep means rebellion. Both are watched, one by the steward, the other by his subjects. Both are punished, one by weather, the other by politics. The peasant works to endure. The king works to be remembered, but neither truly rests, and neither can exist without the other. You feel it before anyone else does, the way your breath shortens, the way your hands shake a little when you lift the pail. You try not to let the others see there's too much to do. The firewood's low, the roof leaks again. There's turnip rot in the cellar. You sit more often. Tell your children to fetch this or that. You smile when they obey, though inside you hate needing help. You were strong once you worked from sunrise to nightfall. You built things with your hands. You never thought about how many winters were left until now. The pain gets worse. There is no doctor. There's no diagnosis. You do not know if it's your lungs or your liver or just your body deciding it's had enough. The midwife comes and gives you a tonic made of bitter root. The healer suggests nettle broth. The priest visits with a candle and a book. He asks if you are ready to confess. You are not because you think you've sinned more than anyone else, but because that's what you do. You confess. You receive the last rites. You try to die with dignity, even if the straw beneath you is wet. And your wife is weeping into her sleeves. In medieval villages, death is part of life. The average life expectancy hovers around 35. But it isn't because people drop dead in their 30s. It's because children die often, and women die. In childbirth and accidents and illness, don't wait if you survive. Past childhood, you might live to 40, maybe even 50, but it's rare to see 60. Your family gathers. They're quiet. They don't ask questions. They know you try to say something meaningful, a lesson, a joke, a goodbye. You try to remember your father's face. You try not to think of your dead son. You think about the fence you never fixed, and the new tools you can't afford, and the wheat you planted that someone else will harvest. There is no funeral procession. There's no tombstone. You're buried behind the church, maybe with a wooden cross. If there's time to carve one, the priest says words in Latin. You don't understand them. You hope God does. And what's left of you, a patched roof, a good rake, a son who knows how to tie a proper bundle of kindling, a daughter who still sings while she milks the goat. Maybe someone will name their baby after you. Maybe. They'll say, he was kind, he worked hard, he never wasted bread. That is enough. Because no one remembers most peasants. Not in books, not in songs, but the world. They built one rock and one bale of hay at a time that stays standing. That's legacy. He feels it too, but he's not allowed to show it. A king dying is a dangerous thing. It unsettles the court. It invites ambition. So the royal physicians say, he's only tired. The courtiers whisper that he is resting his enemies. Wonder how long he has left his body is failing. But protocol does not in medieval Europe. Royal death is a ritualized event. The king does not simply fade. He begins to transition. His bedchamber becomes a chamber of state attendance. Hover clerics arrive. The royal confessor is summoned. The windows are shuttered. The best relics are brought in. He is anointed again, just as he was at coronation, but this time with the oil. Of the dying he confesses. Sins he asks for forgiveness. He clutches a crucifix of gold and mutters prayers learned in boyhood. A scribe stands nearby to write down his last words, or at least something poetic enough to be remembered. The king's death must not be ordinary if he ruled wisely. He is mourned if he ruled poorly. He is endured until the last breath. But in either case, he is treated like a vessel of divinity. Until the end, his family gathers sons. If he has them, a wife, maybe two. A bishop. Read scripture. Trumpets may sound in the courtyard, the realm holds its breath. And when he dies, really dies, the news is announced with fanfare. A black cloth is hung from the castle walls. Church bells toll across the countryside. Messengers ride to the city's nobles, are summoned to court. The royal seal is broken. Then comes the body. His corpse is washed and dressed, sometimes embalmed, sometimes not. Some kings have their organs removed. Some have their hearts buried separately. Some have their bones boiled to be transported without rot. He is placed in a coffin of wood or stone, or even let a likeness may be carved in wax. A death mask taken. The funeral is pageantry, dozens of priests, hundreds of candles, choirs singing psalms, nobles in black, a procession of mourners, some paid to weep, some there to be seen. The coffin is carried on a cart draped in velvet. Horses wear black. The heralds cry out his name title by title. As he is lowered into the tomb, he is interred in a royal crypt, Westminster sanded spire, surrounded by ancestors sealed in stone. His tomb is engraved with Latin verse, his image carved in marble. His sword may lie beside him, a crown may be placed at his feet. Sometimes he's buried with coins, relics, even jewels. His will is read, his heirs, name succession confirmed, but the kingdom does not rest. Wars break out over inheritance. Bastards rise to claim legitimacy. Queens remarry parliaments. Quarrel one. King dies, another takes his place always. And what remains of him? All that bears his name. A cathedral funded by his tithe. A portrait in a dusty hall. Maybe a chapter in a chronicle penned by a monk who never met him. But more often his memory fades, overwritten by the next war, the next tax, the next king. The peasant lies beneath earth and stone. The king lies beneath gold and marble. One is buried by neighbors, the other by nobles. One rests beside a ditch, the other in a crypt. But they are equally. Still time forgets them at the same speed. The world turns without them, grass grows. Over the grave language shifts. Stories blur in the end. Legacy isn't a statue or a monument. It's the echo of your labor, the bread you baked that feed a child, the wall you built that stood another winter, the law you passed that outlasted your bones, the song someone still hums without remembering where they learned it all. Things fade, but some things endure in work, in memory. Insolence. And when both the king and the peasant have crumbled to dust, the only difference is how long it takes the wind to blow their names away. Camels were the perfect choice. Their unique physiology allowed them to travel long distances without water, endure searing heat, and carry heavy loads. But what makes this practice worth remembering isn't just the animal. It's the people who relied on them, who mapped out complex schedules and routes, and who lived their lives by the rhythm of these silent desert journeys. These camel mail routes were slow. Sometimes weeks passed between pickups. But they were dependable, forming a kind of ancient logistical network. Routes often connected key trading centers like Timbuktu, Agadez, and Tamanrasset, cutting across French Saharan territories with minimal infrastructure. You might imagine a postman today stopping briefly at mailboxes, but the desert camel couriers were more like wandering caretakers of human connection. They would pass between oases, tribal encampments, and colonial outposts, dropping letters wrapped in oiled cloth and stored in goat hide pouches. Each stop was both a resting point and a listening post, where news, gossip, and the scent of another world could travel. The men who managed these mail routes were often Tuareg or Berber, born into a nomadic life. They knew the dunes by memory, navigated by the stars, and treated the journey not just as a job, but a form of responsibility. These camel drivers were respected for their endurance and precision. They dressed in flowing robes and face scarves to protect against the sand, often walking alongside their camels rather than riding them. At night, they would sleep under the stars with only the animals and silence for company. Their journeys were measured not in miles, but in time. 3 days to the next well, 5 days to the next settlement, 10 to the next fort. Mail carried through these routes wasn't just letters, it was life. Orders from colonial governors, military dispatches, wedding invitations, money transfers, love notes. In remote outposts, the arrival of a camel with mail was an event. Soldiers might line up for their letters. Families might crowd around to hear news from another region. The arrival of a single pouch of mail could change everything. Of course, letters sometimes got lost. Storms buried trails. Camels perished. Raiders intercepted deliveries. But surprisingly often, the mail made it through. You're still in the Sahara, only now it's night. The heat of the day has vanished, replaced by a cool breeze, and overhead the stars scatter like forgotten pinholes in velvet. A camel exhales slowly. Somewhere in the dark, a mail pouch shifts quietly against a worn saddle. It's hard to imagine that this simple, plodding scene once helped hold an empire together. But that is exactly what it did. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, as European empires raced to claim territories in Africa, reliable communication became critical. For the French, who controlled large swaths of North and West Africa, the camel post was not only a practical solution, it was a strategic necessity. Telegraphs had their limits, especially in places where wires couldn't survive sandstorms or rebellion. Roads were few, and vehicles could barely traverse the deep dunes. So when a colonial officer stationed in Tamanrasset needed to send an urgent report to Algiers or receive supplies from a distant fort, it wasn't a train or telegraph that answered the call. It was a camel. The French formalized camel postal, lines known as La Poste Saharienne, creating relay stations every few days' ride. These were simple, often mud brick outposts with shade, water, and sometimes food. Here, mail would be passed to a fresh courier, or a rested camel team would pick up where the last left off. Some routes stretched over 1,500 kilometers. The process was systematic. Mail was collected and sorted, often by military personnel, and then tightly wrapped in waxed cloth and animal skin to protect it from the elements. Postmasters marked each bundle with dates and destinations, and carefully logged everything in bulky, handwritten ledgers. Camels could carry about 300 pounds of supplies and mail, though not all did. Some were bred or trained specifically for speed and endurance. These were known as meharis, lean, swift camels favored by desert patrols and couriers. Couriers often traveled in pairs or small groups for safety, especially on longer routes. They might share shifts walking or riding, rarely stopping for more than a few hours' sleep. They listened to the wind, smelled the air for sand, and trusted the camel's instincts to detect danger. There are old French military reports of couriers who rode for days through storms, never losing the mail pouch. One tale recounts a courier who, during a sudden desert rebellion, buried the mail in a dry riverbed and circled back a week later to retrieve it, unharmed. Another story speaks of a camel refusing to cross a dune, then moments later, a collapse. Proof that the animal had sensed the loose sand giving way. Without a word spoken, a letter was saved, a courier spared. Most journeys were far less dramatic. Long, silent hours, the squish of camel feet, an occasional hawk gliding overhead, and the persistent thought, am I early? Am I late? Or right on time? With the spread of railways and aviation in the mid-20th century, camel post gradually declined. Planes could carry more, faster. Roads replaced sand tracks. Radios and telegraphs became more reliable. By the 1960s, the camel courier was mostly gone, replaced not by people walking faster, but by machines that didn't need to sleep, eat, or breathe. But even as these networks faded, their legacy lingered. In parts of Niger, Algeria, and Mali, older men still tell stories of when the camel brought the news. The final steps of a camel are quiet, deliberate. Its feet press into the sand, leaving soft impressions that vanish with the wind. So it was with the great Saharan camel mail routes. As modernity crept into the desert, the camel couriers continued their work a little while longer, even as their paths slowly faded into dust and memory. But what do we lose when something as boring as a mail route disappears? In the early days of colonization, these mail routes weren't just logistical tools, they were repositories of knowledge. The couriers, many of whom were Tuareg or Arab nomads hired by colonial forces, were not merely deliverymen. They were desert navigators, oral historians, and cultural bridges. They knew how to read the stars, the dunes, the wind. They could detect a sandstorm a day away, remember ancient watering holes hidden beneath dry wadi beds, and knew which trees meant underground water. Their maps were not ink on parchment, but memory. They didn't just memorize a single path. They held in their minds a lattice work of alternative routes, safe zones, and warning signs, passed down from generations of desert travelers. For all the precision of the French military's paperwork, It was these human maps, the nomadic guides and camel couriers, that kept the post moving through the world's largest desert. Today, speed is the currency of communication. Emails arrive in blinks. Overnight shipping feels slow. But the camel post was a different rhythm, a system of slowness, of patience, of trust. A letter from a colonial officer in Timbuktu might take 3 weeks to reach Algiers. And yet, people waited. They understood that time and distance weren't obstacles. They were facts. You didn't fight the desert. You respected it. The desert, after all, had its own sense of time. Dates ripened when they ripened. Winds changed when they pleased. And a camel never rushed. It simply went, step by step, sand grain by sand grain. Most of the mail was military or administrative. Supply lists, troop movements, colonial reports. But sometimes there were personal letters too. A soldier in an isolated outpost wrote to his mother in Marseille. "The wind has taught me to whisper, for shouting does nothing here." A local merchant sent word of his daughter's wedding to a cousin across the dunes. A teacher in Gao received a journal article 3 months late, but read it by lantern light with quiet excitement. In these mundane parcels, order sheets, weather, notes, simple greetings, was the beating heart of a vast, dispersed society trying to stay in touch. By the mid-20th century, the French had withdrawn from much of Africa. Independence movements surged. New governments took power, and with them came roads, airstrips, radio towers, and buses. The postal camels didn't vanish overnight. Some were repurposed for tourism or ceremonial processions. Others simply returned to their nomadic roles, carrying goods across borders in silence. And yet, their tracks are still there, sometimes literally. In places like the Adrar Plateau or the Tenasrout, faint grooves remain, etched by centuries of padded hooves. Modern travelers, even with GPS, often find themselves following the old caravan lines, not because they're marked, but because they still make sense. We live in a world awash in notifications where silence is rare and stillness suspicious. But the camel post of the Sahara reminds us that slow things matter, that some of the most dependable systems in human history moved at walking speed, that trust could ride on 4 legs across empty landscapes and still arrive months later, faithfully, intact. And perhaps most humbling of all, that a camel, with its swaying gait and slow breath, once did the work of an entire network, guided only by instinct, memory, and the horizon. So, as the sun sets behind the dunes, and the stars begin their patient climb, one might ask, will our fastest messages ever carry the same weight as those wrapped in waxed cloth and delivered by moonlight? You probably don't think much about buttons. Maybe one popped off your coat last winter, and you sewed it back on with muttered annoyance. But there was a time when fastening clothing wasn't just a matter of style or convenience. It was survival, status, and technological innovation, all sewn together. Welcome to the long, surprisingly eventful history of clothing fasteners. Before there were buttons, zippers, or Velcro, people had to get creative about keeping their garments from flapping open in the wind. And the choices they made, bone pins, fiber knots, bronze clasps, can tell us more about ancient life than any royal decree or battlefield victory. So tonight you'll be quietly falling asleep to the riveting world of fasteners. The first clothing fasteners weren't made of anything particularly fancy. Early humans used whatever was at hand: animal sinew, vines, thorns, wooden toggles, and eventually, cords made from twisted plant fiber. A belt made from woven bark might have doubled as a carrying sling. A loop of flax could keep a woolen cloak tied shut against the wind. We're not talking about buttons here. Not yet. Instead, imagine loops and ties. Think more robe sash than shirt collar. These simple knots worked well in early societies, where clothing was more like wrapping a blanket around yourself than slipping into a tailored jacket. Still, as societies grew and materials advanced, people wanted clothes that stayed put, looked neat, and didn't fall off while you were herding goats or gathering wild onions. That's where pins come in. Some of the earliest fasteners that have survived in the archaeological record are bone pins. These were small, sharp, and surprisingly elegant tools. You might imagine them as the prehistoric equivalent of a brooch, but simpler. Just a single pointy piece of carved bone slid through overlapping cloth. Some were plain and purely practical. Others were etched with decorative patterns or fitted with small beads, status symbols, conversation starters, or just the fashion of the day. In Bronze Age Europe and the Near East, pins evolved into more sophisticated forms: bronze fibulae, precursors to the modern safety pin. These devices use tension and a spring mechanism to hold two pieces of fabric together without stabbing the wearer. Kind of a big deal. To have a bronze fibula in 1200 BCE was a bit like having the latest Apple Watch. You weren't just pinning your tunic shut. You were showing off your materials, craftsmanship, and possibly your connections to distant trade routes. Roman senators, Greek philosophers, and Celtic chieftains all had their own signature styles of fasteners. Romans often used fibulae, some round, some elaborately shaped like animals or swords. These weren't just decorative. They kept togas and cloaks in place during long senatorial debates or while marching to war. In Northern Europe, Viking cloak, pins were often shaped like elongated ovals or dragon heads. They were functional, yes, but also carried spiritual or tribal significance. A cloak pin might be passed from generation to generation, carrying the memory of cold winters, long journeys, and shared fires. In Africa, shell fasteners served similar purposes, while in Asia, silk knots and toggles became the norm, especially in China, where the cheongsam and similar garments used knotted cloth loops and pegs to close gracefully over the chest. Fasteners weren't just keeping clothing in place, they were keeping cultures connected. So when did the button, as we now know it, a disc pushed through a hole, make its entrance? The earliest known decorative buttons date back to the Indus Valley Civilization around 2000 BCE. But these weren't yet used for fastening. They were ornaments sewn onto fabric like sequins or beads. Pretty, yes. Functional? Not yet. The breakthrough came in medieval Europe, somewhere around the 13th century. It was during this time that both the button and the buttonhole began to be used together. A revolutionary idea. Now garments could be shaped to the body, fit more snugly, and close more securely. This enabled tailoring, which enabled fashion, which enabled status signaling in entirely new ways. A tight-fitting doublet could be decorated with rows of buttons to show off both wealth and waistline. No, more shapeless robes or sagging cloaks. You were a walking sculpture, buttoned into form. Some of the first mass-produced buttons were made from metal, wood, bone, and even glass. Button guilds formed in cities like Paris and London. Button taxes existed. Button etiquette was a thing. Imagine that, the button, once a humble loop substitute, now a symbol of hierarchy and hygiene. The thing is, nobody really noticed buttons until they were everywhere. And that's what makes them so fascinating. In many ways, they became invisible, just part of the background noise of daily life. But they reshaped how people moved, dressed, and interacted. Soldiers could now wear fitted uniforms that stayed tight in combat. Clergy could design ceremonial robes with rows of buttons down the front. Even children's clothing became more complex. And with every new material, shell, pewter, horn, mother of pearl, the button's aesthetic potential grew. Some buttons were carved with tiny faces. Others held perfume inside. During wartime, buttons sometimes doubled as tiny compasses or hidden compartments. Secret agents in W&D carried escape maps tucked inside button covers. And yet, for most people, the button remained a dull little disc, easy to lose, annoying to sew back on, but absolutely essential. When we left off, buttons had begun to emerge as both practical fasteners and aesthetic flourishes in the medieval world. From carved bone to cast bronze, they had crept onto the cloaks of knights and the robes of merchants. But the story of the button was just getting started. Because in the Renaissance and early modern eras, buttons didn't just keep your doublet closed. They told the world who you were, how much you were worth, and sometimes how much you were hiding. Let's open the wardrobe doors of the 15th to 18th centuries and see just how strange, lavish, and occasionally ridiculous the world of buttons became. The 16th century marked a flourishing of button use across Europe. No longer limited to outerwear or military garments, buttons began to appear on everything. Vests, cuffs, gloves, shoes, even hats. And they didn't come in pairs. Sometimes a single coat might sport dozens, even hundreds of buttons, many of them purely decorative. In fact, some garments were so densely populated with buttons that they could barely be fastened at all. Buttoning up a Renaissance doublet wasn't a quick morning chore. It was a status ritual. A tailor in 17th century Paris might boast a button catalog containing dozens of materials: ivory, gold, jet, tortoiseshell, velvet-covered wood, or even porcelain. Embellished with jewels or miniature painted scenes, buttons became conversation pieces. They told your story before you said a word. Of course, the most elaborate buttons didn't actually fasten anything. They were sewn on in rows, while the real closures, hooks, ties, or hidden stitches, were quietly doing the work behind the scenes. So much for honesty in design. If you were wealthy in the 1600s, you didn't button your own buttons. You had staff for that. Your wardrobe assistant might spend a good 20 minutes securing the buttons on your doublet, breeches, stockings, and sleeves, an act that subtly communicated your elite status. Meanwhile, working-class people had simpler closures, drawstrings, ties, or fewer buttons altogether. Buttons were expensive. Losing one meant either an awkward gap in your outfit or a trip to the button maker, who might charge more than you'd expect for a matching replacement. This is why some tailors began to include extra buttons sewn to the inside of a coat. Not for decoration, just in case. Even today, that tradition survives. Check the inside hem of a modern blazer. and you'll likely find a lonely little button sewn into the lining, a quiet echo of centuries past. Not all buttons were created equal. Some were hollow, some opened. Some hid tiny compartments for carrying perfume, locks of hair, or even smuggled documents. In 18th century England, spy buttons were real, used by both criminals and covert agents. Hollowed-out buttons might contain miniature maps, coded messages, or doses of poison. During the American Revolution, some officers wore buttons with embedded compass needles to help them navigate unfamiliar terrain. One twist of the top, and the tiny compass inside would align north, assuming you weren't too dizzy from battle to read it. And then there was the mourning button. When someone died, their loved ones might wear garments adorned with black jet or onyx buttons, sometimes etched with initials, dates, or tiny skulls. These were both fashion statements and emotional tokens, a way of keeping the deceased close, quite literally at heart. In the 1700s, sumptuary laws across Europe attempted to control how people dressed, including how many buttons they could wear. Why? Because the aristocracy feared that middle-class merchants and craftsmen were dressing above their station, using fancy clothing and fancy buttons to blur social lines. In France, some city councils outlawed the wearing of velvet and gold-threaded buttons by anyone below noble rank. In England, tailors could be fined for using excessive ornamentation on coats. And in some cases, wearing forbidden buttons could get you publicly shamed or taxed. But, as ever, people found ways around the rules. Buttons were made to look plainer on the surface, but glistened with hidden opulence under certain lighting. A matte pewter button might conceal inlaid silver. A modest cloth-covered disc might open to reveal a miniature cameo. Style, like water, found the cracks. By the early 1800s, industrialization was changing everything, including buttons. Where once buttons were hand-carved or cast by artisans, now machines could punch them out in rapid succession. Buttons became more affordable, more uniform, and more widely available. This democratization of fashion meant that suddenly, everyone could afford at least a few buttons on their clothing. This shift also ushered in new materials. Gutta percha, a natural latex from Malaysia. Early plastics like celluloid, and eventually Bakelite all made their button debut. Inexpensive yet stylish buttons were now within reach of both the servant and the schoolteacher. That doesn't mean buttons lost their flair, though. In fact, the 19th century saw a button renaissance. Ladies' dresses might be adorned with pearl or velvet buttons. Men's coats featured rows of brass or horn. Children's sailor suits sported mother of pearl, practical, durable, and elegant. Buttons were no longer just fasteners. They were the jewelry of everyday life. Why are men's shirts buttoned left over right, while women's are right over left? It's a tiny detail, but one with deep historical roots. One theory points to sword fighting. Most men were right-handed, so overlapping left over right made it easier to reach into their tunic with the right hand. Another theory? That upper class. Women had servants to dress them, and it was easier for a right-handed servant to fasten the buttons from the woman's left side. There's no consensus, but the tradition stuck. Even today, this ancient quirk of tailoring persists in modern fashion, long after swords and dressing maids have left the stage. Buttons, as you can see, had a booming life in the centuries between Renaissance art and the steam engine. They were symbols of class, of invention, of personal flair. They adorned portraits, passed through the fingers of spies, and hung on the coattails of revolutionaries. But what happens when a new invention challenges the button's reign? What happens when fashion demands speed, sleekness, and no more holes? By the dawn of the 20th century, buttons had enjoyed an unchallenged reign for nearly a millennium. They had gone from bone pegs on peasant tunics to miniature artworks on royal jackets. They had clasped the cloaks of generals and concealed secrets for smugglers. But history, as always, had plans. And in the early 1900s, a rival quietly emerged. It did not twinkle with inlaid pearls or swivel open to reveal a compass. It did not click daintily into place. It zipped, and buttons, for the first time in centuries, had to consider retirement. The zipper, or something like it, first appeared in 1851 as a fastening for garments, patented by Elias Howe. Yes, the same Elias Howe who invented the sewing machine. But Howe didn't pursue his zipper much further. The idea was ahead of its time. In 1893, Whitcomb Judson introduced what he called the clasp locker, a clunky, unreliable fastener intended for shoes. It was complicated. It jammed. It fell apart. But it inspired a new wave of innovation. Finally, in 1913, Swedish-American engineer Gideon Sundback improved the design, creating the version that closely resembles the modern zipper. He called it the separable fastener. By 1917, the U.S. Army was ordering them for money belts and flight suits. At first, the zipper didn't touch everyday fashion. Buttons still dominated shirts, trousers, dresses, and coats. They were too ingrained in tailoring tradition to be replaced overnight. And besides, early zippers were still clumsy. They were expensive. And they broke. But slowly, steadily, the zipper zipped forward. You'd think the zipper would spell doom for buttons, but the fashion world had other ideas. Buttons offered something zippers couldn't: personality, detail, elegance. While the zipper whispered efficiency, buttons could wink, sparkle, and tell a story. In the 1920s, flapper dresses were dotted with decorative pearl buttons. Men's coats featured broad lapels and lines of thick horn or bakelite buttons. Even as zippers gained traction in children's clothing and military gear, buttons became emblems of high fashion. In fact, some designers doubled down. Coco Chanel used oversized buttons as part of her signature jacket designs. Elsa Schiaparelli's surrealist garments incorporated buttons shaped like insects, musical instruments, or lips. Buttons, instead of fading, simply changed strategy. They leaned into ornament, into charm, into nostalgia, because there was something comforting about fastening a button, one hole at a time, something tactile, something human. Still, the march of progress couldn't be stopped. In the post-world, War II era, as synthetic fabrics and ready-to-wear clothing became the norm, zippers were everywhere. Jeans, jackets, purses, boots. They were fast, uniform, and cheap. But buttons didn't vanish. Instead, they adapted again. Plastic revolutionized button manufacturing. Suddenly, 1,000 buttons could be molded, colored, and finished in an hour. Styles exploded: polka dot buttons, translucent buttons, buttons shaped like cartoon animals, buttons painted with faux marble, brass, or wood grain. Buttons remained. The go-to fastener for shirts and blouses, perhaps because unlike zippers they could pop off rather than jam. That mattered when you were running late or changing quickly. A stuck zipper could ruin your morning. A missing button? You could sew on a spare. Even manufacturers saw value in that. And thus, the lonely spare button continued to accompany tags and receipts in clothing bags across the world, often ignored, but waiting loyally for its moment. In the latter half of the 20th century, buttons made a surprising leap, from clothing to causes. Campaign buttons became miniature billboards. I like Ike. Nixon now. Yes, we can. Political movements and protest groups adopted the button for its simplicity. Cheap to make, easy to wear, impossible to ignore. Suddenly, buttons weren't just about fastening. They were about speaking. Wearing your ideals on your chest, literally. Even today, from election pins to novelty buttons, the tradition continues. It's a quieter use of the button, but a powerful one. While buttons and zippers dominated Western fashion, other regions and traditions maintained their own closure customs. In China, the frog closure, a decorative knotted button, remained standard on many traditional garments. In India, hook and loop fastenings were common on saris and kurtas. In parts of Africa, buttons were both decorative and symbolic, incorporated into beadwork or ceremonial robes. In Japan, the kimono's obi sash required no buttons at all, relying on complex folding and tying. But modern Japanese streetwear, with its blend of East and West, brought buttons back in creative forms: tiny enamel characters, laser-cut wood, or recycled resin. Across the globe, buttons never fully disappeared. They evolved, diversified, and adapted. Today, your fingers press buttons more than ever, but most of them aren't sewn to your coat. They're glass, virtual, embedded in touchscreens and keyboards. Even in clothing, innovation continues. Magnetic. Fasteners, Velcro, elastic bands, and invisible zippers now offer alternatives. But the humble button persists. Walk into any department store and scan the shirts, coats, cardigans, and dresses. Buttons remain the workhorses of daily fashion.